In the winter of 1932, the city of Shanghai was the jewel of Asia. It was a glittering, chaotic metropolis, a fusion of East and West, of immense wealth and desperate poverty. At its heart was the international settlement, a modern city-state governed by a council of Western powers, primarily Britain and the United States. It was a world of jazz clubs, skyscrapers, and foreign gunboats patrolling the Huangpu River. But just across a narrow creek, in the densely populated Chinese districts, a different reality existed. And it was here, in the cold last days of January, that a fire was lit that would serve as a horrifying dress rehearsal for the Second World War. On the night of January 28, 1932, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched a full-scale assault on the Chinese city of Shanghai. What followed was not a colonial police action. It was one of the first major acts of modern urban warfare. Japanese bombers indiscriminately targeted the crowded district of Chapai, turning wooden homes into a sea of fire. Naval destroyers shelled the waterfront, leveling entire city blocks. Elite Japanese Marines, the Blue Jackets, stormed ashore, expecting the Chinese forces to collapse in a matter of hours. But the most surreal and chilling part of this story is not the battle itself. It is the fact that the entire world was there to watch it. From the safety of the international settlement, Western businessmen, diplomats, socialites, and soldiers could stand on the bridges spanning Suzhou Creek, sip cocktails on rooftop bars, and watch a modern city being burned to the ground just a few hundred yards away. They had a front-row seat to a massacre. This is the hidden story of the Shanghai Incident of 1932. It's the tale of the day the world was given a clear, undeniable preview of the horror that was coming, the brutality of Axis ambition, and the death of international law. And in the face of this terrifying vision, they watched, they took photographs, and they did absolutely nothing. The pretext for the attack was flimsy, a manufactured incident typical of Japanese expansionism in the era. Following the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931, anti-Japanese sentiment was running high across China. In Shanghai, after a group of Japanese Buddhist monks was beaten by a Chinese mob, an incident likely instigated by Japanese agents, the Japanese military command issued an ultimatum to the Chinese mayor. They demanded an official apology, the arrest of the perpetrators, and the dissolution of all anti-Japanese organizations. The mayor, desperate to avoid a conflict, agreed to all demands just hours before the deadline. But it didn't matter. The Japanese military was not looking for an apology. They were looking for an excuse. At midnight on January 28th, Admiral Koichi Shirozawa declared that he was compelled to take action to protect Japanese nationals and ordered his forces to attack. The main target was the northern district of Chapai, a labyrinth of narrow streets and wooden houses packed with over 1 million people. The Japanese believed their technologically superior forces would crush the local Chinese garrison in a single, swift blow. But they made a critical miscalculation. They expected to fight a disorganized and poorly equipped force. Instead, they ran into the Chinese 19th Route Army. The 19th Route Army was not one of Chiang Kai-shek's elite central government units. They were a provincial army, seen by many as second-rate. But they were fiercely patriotic and enraged by Japanese aggression. When the Japanese Marines advanced into Chapai, they were met not with a panicked retreat, but with a storm of machine gun and rifle fire. The inferior Chinese soldiers fought back with incredible tenacity. The quick police action the Japanese had envisioned immediately bogged down into brutal, street-to-street fighting. Frustrated and infuriated by the unexpected resistance, the Japanese command escalated the conflict with a horrifying new tactic. On January 29th, aircraft from the Japanese carriers Kaga and Hasho appeared in the skies over Shanghai. They were not targeting military positions. They began a systematic and indiscriminate aerial bombardment of the civilian district of Chapai. It was one of the first terror bombing campaigns in history, a deliberate attack on a civilian population designed to break their will to resist. The effect was catastrophic. The wooden buildings of Chapai were turned into an inferno. Tens of thousands of civilians were killed or wounded. 1 million terrified refugees began pouring out of the burning district, seeking safety in the foreign concessions. And from across Suzhou Creek, The residents of the international settlement watched it all unfold. The Garden Bridge became an unofficial viewing platform. Westerners in fine coats and hats stood alongside American Marines and British soldiers, staring in morbid fascination at the pillar of black smoke rising from the burning city. Journalists and photographers had a front-row seat to the new face of war. They documented the horror, sending back shocking images of bombed-out schools, dead children, and endless lines of refugees. One American reporter described the scene. "We are watching a city being murdered. The Japanese bombers fly over in perfect formation, and we can see the bombs fall. Then comes the explosion, and another section of the city disappears in fire and smoke. It is methodical, scientific, and completely inhuman." The international community was paralyzed. The League of Nations, the great hope for world peace, proved to be completely powerless. They dispatched a committee to investigate. They passed resolutions condemning the Japanese aggression, but they took no meaningful action. The major powers, Britain, France, and the United States, were deep in the throes of the Great Depression. Their populations were staunchly isolationist and had no appetite for a war on the other side of the world. They lodged diplomatic protests, which the Japanese politely ignored. The Western powers had troops and warships in Shanghai, enough to potentially intervene, but they were under strict orders to do nothing more than protect the borders of the international settlement. And so, they stood guard on the bridges, a wall of Western steel separating their world of peace and prosperity from the inferno just across the creek. For the soldiers on the ground, this was a surreal and deeply frustrating experience. American Marines of the 4th Regiment were stationed along Suzhou Creek. They could hear the screams, see the fires, and watch Japanese planes fly directly over their heads to bomb the Chinese city. They were under strict orders not to fire unless fired upon. They became, in effect, spectators to a war crime. Their diaries and letters home are filled with a sense of impotent rage. One Marine wrote, "We watch them bomb women and children every day, and we do nothing. We just stand here and watch. What in God's name are we doing here if not to stop this?" The soldiers' frustration boiled over into minor skirmishes. On one occasion, a Japanese plane flew too low over an American position, and a Marine, unable to restrain himself, opened fire with his machine gun, forcing the plane to retreat. The incident caused a diplomatic crisis, but it was a symptom of a deeper moral rot. The Chinese 19th Route Army, meanwhile, continued their heroic but doomed resistance. For over a month, they held off the far superior Japanese forces. Their defense became a symbol of national pride across China, shattering the myth of Japanese invincibility. But they were alone. China's central government, led by Chiang Kai-shek, offered them little support, more concerned with fighting the internal communist threat. Eventually, the Japanese landed more divisions and outflanked the Chinese defenders, who were finally forced to withdraw in early March. On March 3, 1932, a ceasefire was declared. The battle was over. Shanghai had been saved from total conquest, but a huge part of the city was a smoldering ruin, and over 100,000 people were dead or wounded. The Shanghai Incident of 1932 was quickly forgotten by a world preoccupied with its own economic problems. But it was a terrifying prophecy. Every element that would define the horror of World War II was present here in microcosm. The manufactured pretext for an attack, the indiscriminate bombing of civilian cities, the brutality of urban warfare, the racial ideology that viewed the enemy as subhuman, and perhaps most importantly, the complete failure of the international community to stand up to aggression. The world had shown that it would tolerate a major power invading another country and massacring its population, as long as it didn't directly threaten their own interests. It was a green light for aggressors everywhere. In the years that followed, the lesson was not lost on the rising powers of Germany and Italy. They saw that the League of Nations was a paper tiger and that the Western democracies lacked the will to fight. The road to the invasion of Ethiopia, the occupation of the Rhineland, and the annexation of Austria was paved on the burning streets of Shanghai. The world had been given a clear, unambiguous warning of the kind of warfare the Axis powers intended to wage, a war without rules, without mercy, and without limits. and they had chosen to do nothing. They stood on the bridge, watched the city burn, and then went back to their clubs and their businesses, hoping the fire wouldn't spread. It was a hope born of delusion, a fatal miscalculation that would, in just a few short years, plunge the entire world into an even greater inferno. The smoke over Shanghai in 1932 was the smoke of a coming apocalypse, a warning that went completely unheeded.